Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. Miss Reed is listening to a reminiscence about Mrs. Jarmyn, a lady who was evacuated to Fairacre during the war, and the time she locked horns with Mrs. Pringle at a pre-Christmas jumble sale. Now Mrs. Pringle deposited her mackintoshed bundle with the other clothes and made her way to her stall. Mrs. Jarmyn fell on her knees with the other sorters and began to work with spirit. "Lor," she cried, holding up a moth-eaten moleskin waistcoat, "who'd buy this stuff? Talk about Granny's little old skin rug. Gives you the creeps, don't it?" "My husband's," said one of the helpers shortly. Mrs. Jarmyn seemed not a whit abashed. She began rummaging in the bundle which Mrs. Pringle had brought, making disparaging comments on her discoveries, much to the embarrassment of the Fairacre women, who knew full well how important it was to guard one's tongue on such occasions. "Look at this!" cried Mrs. Jarmyn. "3 shirts and never a button among 'em. Who's pinched the buttons, eh?" Mrs. Pringle, wreathed in seagrass from the unraveling footstool she was carrying, paused by the group and replied loftily, "I took the trouble to remove those shirt buttons. They'll do for another day." "How's that for meanness?" commented Mrs. Jarmyn, twinkling at the others. "The poor chap who buys this will have to go about with his shirt flapping, I suppose." "Some people," began Mrs. Pringle, "knows their duty to their country in wartime, and saves every possible penny, not like some I could mention not 100 miles from here, as buys pineapple chunks when there's rhubarb in the garden." This sideswipe simply had the effect of bringing Mrs. Jarmyn's usual high spirits to bubbling point. Her blue eyes flashed with the joy of battle joined. The onlookers were half fearful and half delighted to see Mrs. Pringle in combat with such a worthy adversary. "Well, I never," crowed Mrs. Jarmyn. "Ain't we high and mighty? But I wouldn't stoop to pinchin' shirt buttons and then givin' the rest to the jumble. About as low as you can get, I reckon." "It's nothing short of patriotism, I tell you," boomed Mrs. Pringle, her neck flushing an angry red. "Save all you can, they keeps tellin' us. Well, I'm savin' shirt buttons." She marched heavily towards her stall, somewhat impeded by the strands of seagrass trailing behind her. Mrs. Jarmyn let out a peal of derisive laughter and continued with the sorting. But she did not forget Mrs. Pringle's last remark. The jumble sale itself passed off without further incident between the two antagonists. In fact, Mrs. Jarmyn covered herself with glory at the men's stall by her shrewd bargaining with customers. Her clients were kept in spasms of laughter by her barrage of raillery and cockney patter. At the end of the sale, it was discovered that her stall had taken by far the largest account, and it was generally acknowledged that Mrs. Jarmyn's cheeky approach to the customers was the reason. "Not much good living near Caledonian Market all your life if you can't pick up a few tips," was Mrs. Jarmyn's reply to those who congratulated her. Needless to say, Mrs. Pringle was not among them. Some months after the sale, at the beginning of November, the good ladies of Fairacre's Women's Institute decided to make their Christmas puddings together. They worked out that the whole process would be much cheaper if they made the mixture in one batch and cooked all the puddings in the large electric copper. The recipe, cut from a daily paper, made grisly reading to those used to the normal ingredients of pre-war puddings. No brandy, stout, fresh eggs, or butter appeared in the 1943 recipe. Instead, such dreadful items as grated carrot, margarine, dried egg powder, and, the final touch of horror, a tablespoonful of gravy browning to enrich the color, figured on the depressing list of ingredients. The times were hard, and years of privation had blunted the sensibilities of even the most fastidious. With much cheerfulness, the ladies set about their preparations for making an economical and nutritious wartime Christmas pudding. Dozens of pudding basins, each bearing their owner's name on adhesive tape stuck on the base, waited on the long tables. Little paper bags bearing treasured ounces of currants and sultanas, mixed spices, breadcrumbs, and 2 precious fresh lemons jostled each other near the enormous yellow mixing bowl from the vicarage. By 10 o'clock, the ingredients were being stirred zealously by half a dozen helpers, most of them elderly women, for the majority were doing war work of some sort or other. Mrs. Willett busily greased the basins with carefully hoarded margarine papers, listening to the chatter about her. "We'll set the copper to very slow," said the vicar's wife, "and then it should be perfectly safe until tea time. Mrs. Willett's staying until 11:30 to make sure it's simmering properly, and then the rota begins." It had been arranged that one or the other of the WI members should look in every hour to see that all was well, and to top up the water in the copper if it was getting too low. Christmas puddings were too precious to be left entirely to themselves for such a length of time. By 11, the puddings were ready for immersion. Every household in Fairacre had one, and some had 2 or 3, standing in the water. This was the Women's Institute's practical help toward Christmas, and very well planned the organization had been. "Here's Mrs. Pringle's," said Mrs. Willett, bearing a stout 2-pounder to the copper. She peered underneath the basin to read the big black capitals on the tape before letting it down gently beside the others. "Then that's the last," said the vicar's wife thankfully. "Just time to have a cup of tea before we knock off." It was very quiet when they had gone. Mrs. Willett took out her knitting and sat by the humming copper. The clock said 20 past 11, and she had promised to stay until half-past. As she knitted, she read the list of names pinned on the wall by the copper. During the afternoon, she saw that Mrs. Pringle and Mrs. Jarmyn were due to call in. Both worked in the mornings and had been unable to stir their own puddings this year. 2:30, Mrs. Pringle. 3:30, Miss Parr, only that would be her maid, Mrs. Willett surmised, and 4:30, Mrs. Jarmyn, who would no doubt rush back to her family in time to fry the inevitable crisps on which that ebullient household seemed to exist. 5:30, anyone welcome. This was when the puddings would be lifted out and handed to their lucky owners. Mrs. Willett had promised to help with this chore. At 25 to 12, she lifted the lid, noted with relief that the water was bubbling gently, checked all the switches, wrote a note to the next pudding minder saying, 25 to 12, everything all right, Alice Willett, and made her way back through the village. At 5:30, a throng of women crowded the steamy hall, collecting their basins and lodging them in shopping baskets, string bags, or the baskets on the front of their bicycles. "Got the right one?" called Mrs. Jarmyn to Mrs. Pringle as she watched that lady peering under the basins for her name. "Bet you've got more fruit in yours than the rest of us." Mrs. Pringle sniffed and ignored the quip. Depositing her pudding in the black depths of her oilskin shopping bag, she passed majestically from the hall without deigning to reply. The fantastic sequel to the pudding-making session might never have been known to Fairacre but for an unusually generous gesture of Mrs. Pringle's. As Christmas Day approached, she heard that a large party of the Jarmyn's friends were proposing to spend the day next door. "My heart fair bleeds for poor Jane Morgan," said Mrs. Pringle lugubriously to her son John. "She'll be crowded out of house and home as far as I can see. I've a good mind to invite her around here for Christmas dinner." Neither Corporal Pringle nor Private Morgan were to be given Christmas leave. Mrs. Pringle's sister and a schoolgirl niece, much the same age as John, were coming from Caxley for the day, and as the sister and Jane Morgan knew each other well, it seemed a good idea to ask their neighbor to join the party. Jane Morgan was gratefully surprised and accepted. The pudding simmered all the morning, and most delightful aromas crept about the kitchen, for there was a duck roasting in the oven, as well as the nutritious wartime delicacy on top of the hob. Mrs. Pringle and her sister had a good gossip, their children played amicably with their new presents, and except for the ear-splitting racket occasioned by the crowd next door, the benevolent spirit of Christmas hung over all. At 12:30, Jane Morgan appeared, thankful to be out of her noisy home, and they all sat down to dinner. The duck was excellent. The pudding looked wonderful. Mrs. Pringle plunged a knife into its gravy-darkened top and cut the first slice. "Mum!" squeaked John excitedly. "There's something shining." "Shh!" said his aunt. "Don't give the game away. Perhaps it's a sixpence." Mrs. Pringle looked puzzled. "No sixpences in this pudding," she said. "In any case, I don't hold with metal objects in food. I always wraps up anything like that in a morsel of greaseproof." She put the first slice on a plate for Mrs. Morgan. There was certainly a suspicious chinking sound as the pudding met the china surface. "When I was little," said Jane Morgan, "we used to have dear little china dolls in our Christmas pudding, no bigger than an inch they were, with shiny black heads. We used to put them in the doll's house, I remember." But Jane Morgan's reminiscences were being ignored, for all eyes were on the pudding. There was no doubt about it, there were a great many shiny foreign objects among the other wartime ingredients. Mrs. Pringle's breathing became more stertorous as the slices were cut. She sat down heavily in front of the last plate, her own, and then spoke. "Just pick it over before you take a mouthful. I reckon someone's been playing tricks with us." Spoons and forks twitched the glutinous mass back and forth amidst amazed cries from the assembled company. When they came to count up the foreign objects, they found no fewer than 24 mother-of-pearl shirt buttons. Mrs. Pringle said not a word, but opened a tin of pineapple chunks instead. Late that night, when the Jarmyn's company had roared away and the children had been chased to bed, Mrs. Jarmyn met her landlady in the communal kitchen. Jane Morgan was in her husband's dressing gown, her wispy hair was in a small pigtail, and her teeth had been left upstairs in a glass of water. She was busy filling a hot water bottle. "Have a good time?" asked Mrs. Jarmyn boisterously. "We had. Never laughed so much since I came here." "That's nice," said Mrs. Morgan politely. "Yes, I enjoyed it next door, but there was something wrong with the Christmas pudding." Mrs. Jarmyn drew in her breath sharply. "What was up with it?" she inquired. "It was absolutely stuffed with shirt buttons," said Mrs. Morgan, wide-eyed. Mrs. Pringle was dumbfounded. "Shirt buttons!" echoed Mrs. Jarmyn. She broke into peals of noisy laughter. "Ah, well," she gasped through her spasms, "that should please the old trout. She told me once she saved shirt buttons." Still laughing, she made her way upstairs, followed by her mystified landlady. Mrs. Willett straightened herself and patted my garden gate. "Well, Miss Reed, that's the story. Of course, it was all over Fairacre before Boxing Day sunset. Jane Morgan let it out in all innocence, and the village was fair humming with the news." "Did Mrs. Jarmyn ever admit it?" I asked. "Never. Swore she never knew a thing about it. But it was her all right. I should know. I remember the pudding list. 2:30 Mrs. Pringle. It wouldn't be her. 3:30 Miss Parr. That was her Annie that popped in then, as law-abiding as they come, and wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. 4:30 Mrs. Jarmyn. And 5:30 all welcome. Don't need much working out when you come to think of it." She bent to pick up her basket and stroked Tibby affectionately. "I will say, though," she continued, "that Mrs. Pringle minded her manners a bit more after that, when she and Mrs. Jarmyn got together. Ah, she was real mischieful, Mrs. Jarmyn. You couldn't help liking her." Mrs. Willett gazed with unseeing eyes down the Fairacre lane, her mind on times long past. "I shall miss them, you know, them Londoners. I liked 'em, and always shall. It was good to see them again this afternoon. Took me back to the old days. Say what you like about 'em, Miss Reed, Londoners are a larky lot, a real larky lot." Chapter 9. Outlook Unsettled. As often happens when term begins, the weather became idyllic. Great white clouds sailed indolently across pellucid blue skies, and warm winds from the south replaced the sneaky little easterly ones that had harassed us throughout most of the Easter holidays. One warm afternoon in late April, we propped the door of the schoolroom open with an upturned flower pot and did our best to turn our attention to learning Robert Bridges' poem, "Spring Goeth All in White." It seemed an admirable choice in the circumstances, for white narcissi split their heady fragrance from the window-sill, white daisies gathered by the children filled 3 paste pots on my desk, and an early cabbage-white butterfly opened and shut its wings against the south-facing Gothic window. Nevertheless, it was uphill work. Languor, born of unaccustomed heat, engulfed my class. Shirt necks were opened, sleeves rolled up, jerseys peeled off and stuffed in desks, and the sing-song country voices stumbled heavily through this most tripping of spring lyrics. Sleepiest of all was young Richard, not yet 5, who was spending the day with us while his mother paid a necessary visit to the hospital in our country town. It is not easy to get someone to mind a child in a small village, and I often get urgent requests asking me if our youngest can come along with his brother for an hour or two. If it is possible, and it usually is, we all enjoy the newcomer's company, and it gives him an insight into school routine before he takes the plunge himself later on. Richard lolled on the desk beside his brother Ernest, who nudged him occasionally and whispered severely to him, with no noticeable result. As we battled on, Richard amused himself by blowing large glassy bubbles from lips as red and puckered as a poppy petal. Ernest, scandalized, bent down to remonstrate. "Leave him alone, Ernest," I said mildly. "He's tired. Perhaps he'll fall asleep." "In school?" cried Ernest, deeply shocked. "Why not?" Ernest, still looking affronted by my slackness, drew himself up, folded his arms, and applied himself sternly to the task before him, ignoring the indolent and shameful child beside him. Everywhere in the room were emblems of spring. The weather chart for April showed a number of umbrellas depicting the rainy weather during the holidays, with arrows pointing fairly consistently to the northeast. But a row of triumphant suns, like yellow daisies, blossomed in the last 6 or 7 squares, and the arrows were now happily reversed. Across the back of the room ran a frieze of spring flowers, crocuses, daffodils, tulips, and a large number of new species as yet unknown to Messrs. Sutton and Carter had been cut out of gummed paper and affixed by every hand in the class. Many a fat thumb went home in the afternoon bearing an indented ring made by hard-working school scissors. It was, as the seed catalogues say, a riot of bloom, and a very colorful addition to our dull walls. A new spring poster to encourage savings showed a bird and its nest, brightened the door between 2 classrooms, and the nature table was laden with wood anemones, primroses, violets, sprays of young honeysuckle leaves, a few early coltsfoot and dandelions, and a splendid pot of horse chestnut twigs thrusting out green hands in all directions. Hard by, the glass fish tank glimmered with shiny frog spawn for all the world like submerged chainmail. The tiny dots were already beginning to turn into commas, and before long the children's patience would be rewarded by the sight of a myriad thrashing tadpoles. Nothing could be more suitable, I told myself again, than "Spring goeth all in white" for such an afternoon. But there was no doubt about it, those 8 exquisite lines were really more than the children could manage under the circumstances. I felt impatient and cross at their laziness, but was loath to spoil the poem for them by bad-tempered bludgeoning. In the midst of all this impasse, young Richard raised himself, stretched short arms each side of his rumpled head, and said clearly, "Let's go out." There was a shocked silence. The sound of a bee droning up and down the open door could be heard distinctly as the children waited to see what my reaction would be. Sometimes a remark like this will make me fly clean off the handle, and they shivered with apprehension. Ernest's face was scarlet at the effrontery of his younger brother. I looked at the expectant children. "What about it? Shall we?" I said. There was a rapturous roar of agreement and a general stampede to the lobby. The air outside was wonderful, heady and honeyed with hundreds of unseen flowers. The elm trees at the corner of the playground were rosy with buds and noisy with rooks at their building. We straggled down the village street between the beds of velvety polyanthus and the neat kitchen gardens striped with vegetable seedlings. Birds flashed across our path, dogs panted on cottage doorsteps, and a cuckoo's call seesawed across the afternoon. All this, of course, was what had held my class in thrall, the compelling, imperious spell of spring. Of what use were the frieze, the crayoned sun, the poster, the laden nature table, and the captive frog spawn? They were but substitutes for the real thing that exploded all around them. It was the babe among us, young Richard, still in touch with the vital stuff of living, who had led us unerringly to reality. We made our way slowly up the sunny slopes of the downs before throwing ourselves down on the dry, springy turf in order to revel in the full glory of a warm spring day. Below us spread the village like some pictorial map. The trees were misted with young leaves, and here and there a flurry of white blossom lit up a garden. I thought of our poem left neglected, but felt no regret. Let us savor this now, and then come to Robert Bridges' poem, recollecting it in tranquility, was my feeling. A row or two of flapping washing caught the eye, and a herd of black and white Friesians belonging to Mr. Roberts looked like toys as they grazed peacefully in the field next to the school. I gazed at it all with a particular interest this afternoon, for I had a problem on my mind. Would it, I wondered, be a good thing to leave Fairacre? I suppose that most people feel unsettled in the early spring. There must be something in the rising of the sap and the general urgency of the season that makes us long for change and movement. I read the appointments vacant at the end of the Times Educational Supplement with unusual fervor during March and April, and usually find that this pastime calms the fever in my blood. What about this job in Sicily, I asked myself. Would I really be able to teach English by direct method? Come to think of it, are any of my teaching methods direct? Is the teaching of spring goeth all in white direct when one abandons the task to scramble up the springy turf of the downs, for instance? There is a wonderful post offered in Barbados and another in New Zealand and several in Dar es Salaam. I only consider those in a warm climate, you notice. But alas, I am not a communicant member of the Presbyterian Church, nor am I qualified to teach practical brickwork or plumbing. I browse among these delights over my cup of tea when the children of Fairacre have run home, and only the voice of Mrs. Pringle at her after-school cleaning is heard in the land. After half an hour or so of this mental dallying, I rouse myself, take stock of my nice little schoolhouse, the fun I have in Fairacre, and decide I am better off where I am. In any case, the thought of filling up forms and asking people to give references for me, if need be, is enough to dissuade me from any serious application as a rule. By the end of April, my spring fever has usually abated. Fairacre looks more seductive than ever. I find, surprisingly, that I am in love with all the children, and even look upon Mrs. Pringle with an indulgent eye. Such is the power of warm weather. But this year, my feelings are stronger. If I really wanted promotion as headmistress of a larger school, then it was time I stirred myself before I became too decrepit to be considered at all. As Amy, my old college friend, frequently tells me, and reiterated with considerable force the other evening when I mentioned a particular post I had seen advertised, I have been in Fairacre long enough. It might be better for the school as well as for me to have a change. The job which had caught my eye was the headship of a junior and infants school in South Devon. I knew the little town fairly well from visiting it at holiday times, and because I had friends in the neighborhood. It was a market town, rather smaller than Caxley, about 5 miles from the coast, and situated away from the main roads which were so busy in summertime. And we'll find out if Miss Reed succumbs to the charms of Devonshire next time.